The words hit Letitia Boone like a branding iron pressed flat against her sternum, searing through the exhaustion and the grief and the months of grinding, breathless labor she had poured into this cracked and stubborn earth. She had been reaching for the top post of the fence line, her gloves already split at the knuckles, her shoulders trembling with the particular kind of fatigue that lives not in the muscle but in the marrow, when she heard his voice come across the yard. Low and deliberate, the way a man speaks when he has been holding something back for a very long time and has finally decided the weight of silence is greater than the risk of speaking. "I have watched you work," Warren Sawyer said, standing there with his hat in both hands, weathered fingers rolling the brim in that slow circle she had learned to recognize, "and I have never seen harder." She did not turn right away. She could not. Because if she turned and she saw pity in his face, she was going to come apart right there at the fence line with the Texas sun hammering down on both of them, and she had promised herself. She had made herself a sacred iron promise the morning she buried her father in the rocky soil behind the house that she would not come apart. Not here. Not in front of anyone. Not ever. But when she finally turned, pity was not what she saw on Warren Sawyer's face. What she saw there was something far more dangerous, far more destabilizing, something that cracked her careful armor more effectively than any expression of sympathy could have managed. What she saw was pure and unguarded recognition, the look of a man who has lived inside the same storm and knows exactly what the lightning feels like. And it was that recognition, that moment of being truly seen, that broke her open. She had to understand how she had arrived at this fence line, this moment, this man. Because none of it had been simple, and none of it had been clean, and the road that had brought Letitia Boone to this particular piece of West Texas in the autumn of 1884 was paved with betrayal and hidden motive, and the kind of desperate, forced choices that leave marks on a person long after the circumstances that created them have passed. Letitia had come to Caldwell County from Tennessee, which was already a story of loss before it was anything else. Her mother had died of fever when Letitia was 16, leaving her to manage the small farm east of Knoxville with her father, Clement Boone, a man who was at once the finest and most infuriating person she had ever known. Clement was brilliant with cattle and hopeless with money, generous to a fault with neighbors, and completely blind to the slow erosion that generosity created in their own finances. By the time Letitia was 20, they were mortgaged to a man named Aldous Prentice, who held the paper on half the farms in Roane County, and had been collecting on those papers with an enthusiasm that had made him very rich and very despised. Clement Boone had read an advertisement in a farming newspaper. Land available in Caldwell County, Texas. Good grazing, reliable water from Plum Creek, parcels running from 200 to 600 acres available to qualified settlers willing to prove the land within 3 years. The advertisement had been placed by a land company out of Austin that was genuinely legitimate, which was something of a miracle given the era, and Clement had taken it as a sign. He had borrowed a little more from Aldous Prentice, just enough for the passage and the filing fees, had shaken hands with men he would never see again, and had loaded Letitia and every implement and animal they could transport onto a series of trains and wagons that carried them west across the width of a continent. Letitia had been 22 when they arrived. That was in the spring of 1882. The land was beautiful in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with ease. It was vast and golden and horizontal in a manner that Tennessee's folded hills had never prepared her for, and the sky above it was so enormous that on the first clear night she stood outside the small frame house that had been left by a previous failed settler. She had felt genuinely dizzy looking up at it, as though the world had been turned upside down, and she was clinging to the bottom of it by sheer stubbornness. Clement had been happy in a way she had not seen him since before her mother's death. He moved through that first spring with a lightness that made her heart ache with gratitude, building the corrals, grading the drainage, talking to the cattle he had purchased from a stockman in Lockhart, with the tender, one-sided conversation he reserved for animals and fences and things that could not talk back and therefore could not argue with him. The darkness arrived with the summer and did not leave. The drought that settled over central Texas in the summer of 1882 was not the worst in the region's history, but it was severe enough, and their land was new enough, and their reserves were thin enough, that it hit the Boone farm with particular cruelty. 3 of the 12 cattle they had purchased died. The kitchen garden Letitia had put in with enormous effort produced almost nothing. The creek that had been described in the land company's advertisement as reliable showed itself to be reliable only in the sense that it could be relied upon to be dramatically affected by rainfall, of which there was none. Clement had worked himself through that first drought with the grimly cheerful determination of a man who refused to acknowledge that things were bad, because acknowledgement felt too much like surrender. Letitia had worked beside him and had not been cheerful about it, had instead developed the focused and somewhat frightening efficiency that would later make Warren Sawyer stop at the fence line and say what he said. They had survived 1882 and 1883 had been better, genuinely better, wet enough that the grass came back, and the cattle fattened, and Letitia had planted a larger garden that actually produced what it was supposed to produce. And she had started to believe, cautiously, the way a person believes in something they have been burned by before, that maybe the worst was behind them. And then Clement Boone had gotten sick in the February of 1884. It was pneumonia, which the doctor in Lockhart said was straightforward, and the straightforward truth was that it killed him in 11 days. Letitia had sat beside him through every one of those 11 days, sleeping in the chair next to his bed in shifts of 2 and 3 hours when he finally fell unconscious, holding his hand through the worst of it, reading to him from the almanac because it was what he liked, listening to his breathing change and thin, and finally stop on a cold Tuesday morning with the light just beginning to come through the window. She had buried him behind the house. She had notified the county clerk. She had notified Aldous Prentice in Tennessee, who had responded with a letter of condolence that was also, unmistakably, a reminder that the debt Clement had carried to Texas still existed and still accumulated interest. And then Letitia Boone, 24 years old, 40 miles from the nearest town of any size, with 12 cattle and a proving claim that required her to demonstrate continued cultivation for another year before it would be fully hers, had put on her work gloves and gone outside and started the morning chores. Because what else do you do? The neighboring property to the north and west of her claim, a spread of roughly 400 acres, had been owned for the past decade by a man named Warren Sawyer. She knew him by sight because, in a county this sparsely populated, you knew your neighbors by sight whether you made any effort at it or not. She knew him by reputation because, in a county this sparsely populated, reputation traveled faster than news. He was known as a fair man, a hard man, not hard in the manner of cruelty but hard in the manner of stone, someone who had been shaped by difficulty into something that would not easily break. She knew that he was 36 years old, which made him 12 years older than her. And she knew that he had come to Caldwell County from somewhere in Kansas, though the details of what had brought him here were the kind of thing that people in this part of Texas discussed in the tone of voice that suggests they know more than they're saying. She knew he had never married, which was unusual for a man his age and circumstances, and which people had opinions about, and which Letitia had not considered to be any of her business. Their first genuine conversation had happened 3 weeks after she buried her father, which put it in early March, when the cold was still sharp in the mornings and the mesquite had not yet leafed out. She had been attempting, with limited success, to repair the north fence of her property, which had suffered a section collapse during the wet weather of the previous week. The wire was old and difficult, and she was on her 3rd attempt to splice it when she heard a horse on the other side of the fence and looked up to find Warren Sawyer sitting his bay gelding not 10 yards away, watching her with the particular expression of a person who has been watching for a few minutes already and has made a decision about speaking. "You've got the pliers turned wrong," he said. "The grip'll hold better if you turn them." She looked at the pliers. She looked at him. "I appreciate that," she said, in the precise tone of voice that communicated she was not entirely certain she appreciated it. "You're Clement Boone's daughter," he said. "I am," she said. "Letitia." He nodded. He had a face that the West Texas sun had worked on for years, deeply lined around the eyes from squinting against that enormous sky, jaw set with a habitual firmness that she suspected he wore even in sleep. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that she noticed and then immediately decided was not relevant information. "I heard about your father," he said. "I'm sorry for it." She turned the pliers the way he had indicated and tried the splice again. It held. "Thank you," she said. There was a pause that should have been awkward but was not quite, and then he touched his hat and rode on, and that was the first conversation. The second conversation happened 2 weeks later when one of her cattle, an aggravating and perpetually boundary-testing heifer she had privately named Gertrude, found a gap in the south fence and wandered onto Sawyer's property. He had driven her back himself, coming to the front door of the house in the late afternoon and telling Letitia with a completely straight face that he had found her animal attempting to organize a rebellion among his own stock. Letitia had stared at him for a moment, trying to determine if he was being serious. He was not being serious. The discovery that Warren Sawyer possessed a dry and self-contained sense of humor was the second thing she noticed about him, and she also decided that was not relevant information. "Thank you," she said. "I'll repair the south fence." "The gap's in the corner post," he said. "The post itself needs replacing. I've got cedar posts cut if you need them." She had looked at him carefully, trying to identify the hidden motive in the offer, the trap she had been trained by Aldous Prentice's existence to expect from gestures of generosity. She found nothing but a practical man who happened to have extra fence posts. "I would appreciate that," she said, and this time she meant it without qualification. He had brought the posts the next morning in a wagon, stacked neatly, and had not offered to help install them, which she also noticed, because there was a version of this kind of help that was about making yourself feel useful at someone else's expense, and that was not what this was. He had simply brought her what she needed and trusted her to know what to do with it. March became April and April became May. Letitia worked the claim with a discipline that was rooted partly in genuine love for the land her father had chosen and partly in the specific fuel of a woman who has been told, directly and indirectly, and in every register of social communication available, that she will not be able to manage. Not the claim itself, which was the thing people said out loud, and not the deeper, more private things, which were the things people said with their eyes and their silences. She managed. The spring planting went in on schedule. The cattle were healthy. She found, repaired, or reinforced every section of fence on the property. She made the quarterly payment to the county clerk for the proving claim. She wrote a letter to Aldous Prentice explaining, in language that was simultaneously perfectly polite and absolutely unmistakable, that his debt would be paid from the proceeds of this land, and not 1 day sooner than was logistically possible, and that further letters of the type she had been receiving would be responded to through the county courthouse. She did not write to anyone in Tennessee asking for help, because there was no one in Tennessee who could have helped, and also she would have died first. She interacted with Warren Sawyer in the manner of neighbors in this part of the world, which was to say occasionally, and with the specific practical directness that distance and circumstance require. He helped her when help was offered in the straightforward, non-patronizing manner she had identified as his particular style of generosity. She repaid in kind wherever she could, once helping his hired hand track down a steer that had been lost along the creek, once delivering a message to his ranch house when she was riding to Lockhart, and he had asked her to tell his man to have the wagon ready by Thursday. What she did not do was allow herself to think about the gray-green eyes or the low, deliberate voice, or the fact that he was one of approximately 4 people in Caldwell County who spoke to her without either condescension or excessive solicitude. One of the 4 people who seemed to understand, without explanation, that what she needed was not management or rescue, but simply to be treated as someone capable of her own existence. She did not allow herself to think about any of that. She had a dark past of near poverty and loss, and she had a present of grinding work and a future that was entirely contingent on things she could not fully control. And the last thing she needed, the very last thing, was to complicate any of it with feelings for a neighbor whose own history was composed of significant and apparently unresolved secrets. The secret came to light in early June, brought to her unwillingly by Marjorie Connell, the wife of the feed store owner in the town of Prairie Wells, which was the nearest settlement to both their properties. Marjorie was a woman whose fundamental generosity was unfortunately inseparable from her fundamental inability to keep information to herself, and she delivered the story about Warren Sawyer with the particular energy of someone who believes they are doing you a favor by telling you something you might prefer not to know. Warren Sawyer had come to Caldwell County from Abilene, Kansas, 8 years ago. He had come alone, and in a manner that suggested deliberate separation from whatever he had left behind. What he had left behind, according to Marjorie, who had gotten this from her cousin who had gotten it from a former Abilene resident who had eventually settled in Lockhart, was a woman and a partnership that had both ended badly, in the specific West Texas sense of badly, which meant there had been legal proceedings, and someone had gone to jail for a short period, and someone had left the territory. The woman was engaged to him, Marjorie said, lowering her voice in the way of someone who relishes the lowering of their voice, and she ran off with his business partner. His partner who had also, apparently, been helping himself to their shared cattle operation for 2 years. Warren took him to court and won, but by then half the cattle were gone and the woman was gone with them, and apparently he sold what was left and came here, and that was the end of it. Letitia had listened to this, and had then done what she always did with information that activated the complicated regions of her emotional interior, which was to file it away in the locked cabinet in the back of her mind, and tell herself it was none of her business. The problem was that knowing Warren Sawyer had been betrayed at the foundations by people he trusted, had had his livelihood and his future stolen by a hidden motive he had not seen coming, had been left alone in exactly the manner that left a mark, made the gray-green eyes and the low, deliberate voice significantly more difficult to file away, because she knew what it felt like to have the floor pulled out. She knew what it felt like to look at the remains of something you had worked for and loved, and then stand up and keep going because the alternative was unacceptable. She filed it away anyway. She went back to the fence. June brought a new difficulty in the form of Harlan Creed, who owned a large cattle operation south of Lockhart, and who had apparently decided that Letitia Boone's proving claim represented an opportunity. He had come to see her in early June with an offer to purchase her claim at a price that was, as she calculated it, roughly 60% of what the land was actually worth, dressed up in the language of charity and neighborly concern with such flagrant dishonesty that it had genuinely impressed her in a perverse way. "It's a lot for a woman alone," Harlan Creed had said, sitting in her front room with his hat on his knee and his smile fixed in the manner of a man who has been told he is charming and has decided to use this without ethical restriction. He was perhaps 50, broad in the way of men who had been strong once and were now simply large, with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of getting what you want through social pressure and financial leverage. No one would think less of you for deciding to sell and go back to where your people are. "My people are buried behind this house," Letitia had said, keeping her voice level with the same effort she had been keeping things level for 4 months, "and I have no intention of selling." Creed had left, but not without making it clear in the way of men of his type that this was not a finished conversation. He would be back. The offer, or something like it, would be back, and if she refused long enough, the offer would eventually stop being an offer and become something else. She had not told Warren Sawyer about Creed's visit. It was her problem to manage. She had managed everything else. But she had thought about it, lying awake on the nights when the work was done and the house was quiet, and the darkness felt like its own particular kind of weight. She had thought about the trap that was being laid around her, patient and deliberate, by a man who had the resources to wait her out. She had thought about the forced choice she might eventually find herself facing: sell to Creed at his price, or find some other way to finance the remaining year of the proving period, when Aldous Prentice's debt was eating at her reserves like a slow fire. It was the middle of July when she found the second gap in her fence, along the north boundary this time, near the fence line that she shared with Warren Sawyer's property. She was examining the gap, trying to determine if it had simply failed or if it had been helped to fail, when she heard the hoofbeats on the other side and looked up to find him there, as she often seemed to find him, having already been watching for a moment before she noticed. This time she did not pretend that the observation was irrelevant. "Did you find any of my cattle on your side?" she asked, because the gap was large enough. "No," he said. He dismounted, which was new. He tied his horse to the fence post and came around through the gate, which was 20 yards down, and crouched to look at the break in the wire. He looked at it for a long time. "This was cut," he said. She had suspected it. Hearing it confirmed in his flat, certain voice was different from suspecting it. She felt the anger move through her like a current, clean and hot, and she let it move, and then she put it somewhere useful. "Creed," she said. He looked up at her. "He came to see you." "In June," she said. "He wants to buy the claim." Warren Sawyer stood up. He was a tall man, and she was not a short woman, but he had those extra inches, and she was conscious of them in the way you become conscious of things you have been trained to ignore. "He's done this before," Warren said, "to a family named Holloway on the east side of the county. Cut their fences until their cattle wandered, then bought their claim when they couldn't afford to replace the stock they lost." The trap was clearer than she had understood. The forced choice was sharper than she had calculated. "I'm not selling," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not evaluating and not measuring, just looking. "I know you're not," he said, and there was something in his voice that she had no name for and did not attempt to name. They repaired the fence together that afternoon, which was the first time they had worked alongside each other directly, and it turned out they moved in a rhythm that fit. Not in the way of people who have planned it, but in the way of people who have the same practical instinct about what needs to happen next, who reach for the same tool at the same moment, and then adjust without conflict or awkwardness, who can work in silence without the silence becoming a problem. She noticed this. She noticed him. She noticed the way he handled the wire with a kind of absolute competence that was also somehow gentle, the way he checked her work without making the checking into commentary, the way he talked about practical things in the low, deliberate voice while she thought about the other conversation, the one that was happening in the space between the practical words, and told herself firmly that she was imagining it. She was not imagining it, but she was not ready. In August, Harlan Creed escalated. 3 of her cattle went missing. She found them 3 days later on Creed's land, which was technically east of Prairie Wells and technically too far from her property for their absence to be accidental, though of course Creed expressed bewilderment and offered to return them at once with a smile that communicated clearly that he was not bewildered at all. The county sheriff, a man named Dawes who was not corrupt so much as pragmatically cowardly, accepted Creed's bewilderment and did nothing. The dark past of Harlan Creed, which she pieced together through conversations with people in Prairie Wells who were afraid of him but not entirely silent about it, included 2 or 3 other proving claims that had changed hands in circumstances similar to what was happening to her, and a reputation in Lockhart that was described to her by the feed store man as someone who knew how to work within the law by staying just beside it, never quite inside it. She wrote a letter to the county courthouse in Lockhart detailing the missing cattle, the cut fence, and Creed's June visit with his offer. She filed it formally with the clerk, who received it with the particular expression of someone who does not expect that documentation to accomplish anything, but recognizes the value of the record. It was the best she could do through official channels. Warren had heard about the cattle. He came to her 2 days after she recovered them, and this time he came to the door rather than to the fence, which was a kind of crossing she was aware of without naming it. "I want to tell you something," he said, standing at the door with the afternoon sun behind him, "and I want you to hear it the way I mean it." "All right," she said. "I have connections in Lockhart," he said. "A lawyer named Birch who handled my own situation some years back. He's good and he's honest, and he knows how to deal with men like Creed who operate in the gray areas. I'd like to write you an introduction." She studied his face for the hidden motive, and found only the same thing she always found when she looked at Warren Sawyer's face, which was the absence of hidden motive. Whatever he was, and he was complicated and closed and carrying more weight than he showed, he was not a man who operated through manipulation. "Why?" she asked, not because she doubted him but because she needed to understand. He seemed to consider the question seriously, as though it deserved a real answer rather than a social one. "Because what Creed is doing is wrong," he said, "and because you are the hardest working person I have encountered on this land and you deserve to keep what you've earned." She felt something move in her chest, quiet and deep, like the sound of water underground. She pushed it down. "I'll take the introduction," she said. Birch the lawyer was, as Warren had described him, genuinely skilled and genuinely honest, which combination was unusual enough that Letitia was briefly suspicious of it before she became convinced. He reviewed her documentation, listened to her account of events, and then told her with the calm precision of a man who has spent years in the legal mechanics of frontier land disputes that Creed had exposed himself by returning her cattle, because in doing so he had acknowledged contact with them, which in combination with the location of recovery and the timing of the cut fence and the recorded June offer created a paper case that was not certain but was substantial. "I won't promise you a quick resolution," Birch said, in his cluttered Lockhart office with its smell of tobacco and legal paper. "Creed has resources and he'll use them. But I can file an injunction against interference with your cattle and your property that will make the next move costly for him, and I can make it expensive enough that he may decide you're not worth the trouble." "How much will this cost me?" she asked, because she needed to know. Birch told her. It was manageable, but it was not nothing, and it was money she had been planning to use against the Prentice debt, which meant the timeline on that extended, which meant more interest accumulating in Tennessee while she managed a legal fight in Texas. She sat with the numbers. She agreed. Warren had waited outside the law office. He had brought her here in his wagon, which had required them to sit beside each other for the 40-mile round trip to Lockhart, which had been the longest unbroken stretch of time she had spent in his company, and it had been, unexpectedly and inconveniently, the best day she had had in months. They had talked, not about Creed or the claim or the cattle or anything weighted. They had talked about Tennessee and about Kansas, about her mother and his grandmother who had come west from Ohio in a covered wagon in 1849 and died in California before the gold rush was finished, about cattle breeding and fence construction and the specific injustice of Texas summers. She had laughed twice. Not the polite social laugh, but the real one, the one that startles you from the inside when you were not expecting it. He had looked at her both times with those gray-green eyes and the slightly softened version of his habitual firmness, and she had looked away both times and kept looking away because she was not ready. When she came out of Birch's office, Warren was leaning against the wagon wheel reading a newspaper with the focused attention he gave to everything, and he looked up at her and read her face with the same efficiency he brought to reading fence lines, and he said, "Good, good," she said. On the drive back, the afternoon light going golden over the mesquite, she had told him about Aldous Prentice. She was not sure why she told him. She had not told anyone in Texas about Prentice because Prentice was the dark past, and the dark past was private. But something about the way the day had gone, something about the particular ease of being in his company, had unlocked it, and she heard herself explaining the debt and the timeline and the compounding interest with the detached precision she used for things she had decided to be rational about rather than feel. He had listened without interrupting, which was one of his qualities. When she finished, he said, "How much is the debt total?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's manageable," he said, "if the cattle year comes in the way it looks like it will." "I know," she said. "I know it's manageable. I just need to not have Creed cutting my fences and stealing my cattle while I manage it." "He won't," Warren said. And the certainty in his voice was not the empty certainty of someone trying to make you feel better, but the solid certainty of someone who has assessed the situation and formed a genuine conclusion. And she believed him in the specific way you believe a person whose judgment you have observed and found to be reliable. She looked at his profile against the late afternoon sky, the weathered lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, and felt the thing in her chest that had been moving quietly for weeks become impossible to ignore. She did not say anything. She looked away at the mesquite and the red-gold horizon and thought about what it meant to trust someone again after the world had given you very good reasons not to. September was complicated by weather, by Creed's lawyers responding to Birch's injunction with their own paperwork, and by the arrival of a letter from a cousin of her father's in Memphis who had somehow heard about Clement's death and about Letitia's situation, and had written to suggest, in the most well-meaning possible manner, that Letitia might be happier returning to a place where family could look after her. She had read this letter twice, feeling the complicated mixture of gratitude for the care behind it and fury at the assumption embedded in it, and had written a polite and final response that made clear she was exactly where she intended to be. She was exactly where she intended to be. This was something she had known for months, but the letter from Memphis crystallized it. This land, this difficult horizontal golden demanding land, was hers in the way that few things had ever been hers, and she was not leaving it for Creed or Prentice or well-meaning cousins or any other force in the universe. Warren came by in the second week of September to tell her that the legal situation had shifted. Creed had made a procedural error in his lawyer's response to Birch's injunction, something to do with the filing timeline, and Birch was going to exploit it. It was not a killing blow, but it was a significant one, enough to demonstrate to Creed that this particular proving claim was going to cost him more in legal fees than it would ever be worth at 60% of market value. He told her this at the fence line, which is where they often found themselves, because it was the midpoint between their properties and a natural place to stop when one was riding the boundary and encountered the other doing the same. She had been reattaching wire to the east post, the afternoon sun warm on her back, when his horse appeared and he swung down and told her about Birch's news. She straightened up and looked at him, and something had shifted in the air between them. The accumulation of months had pressed things to a new configuration, and they were both standing inside it, aware of it, neither of them quite ready to name it. "Thank you," she said, "for Birch, for all of it." "I didn't do much," he said. "You did," she said, and held his gaze, and the holding of the gaze was its own kind of statement. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the drive back from Lockhart, that particular gray-green look that had no calculation in it, only honesty, and then he put his hat back in his hands and started turning the brim in that slow circle, and he said, "I have watched you work, Letitia. Since March. Every day I've ridden my north boundary, and you've been there, in all conditions, working this land the way most men I have known wouldn't have the endurance to work it, and I have never seen harder." And that was when she had stopped being able to hold it at arm's length. Not because of the compliment, though the compliment was real and it struck her in the place she had kept protected, the place where the long months of isolation and effort had built a secret tender bruise, but because of the word watched. He had said he had watched. All this time, In all his silence and his quiet practicality and his non-intrusive neighborliness, he had been watching, and not in the manner of surveillance but in the manner of a person who is drawn to something and cannot stop themselves from looking. She had turned back to the fence because she had needed a moment. And then she had turned back to him, and the tears that came were not the theatrical kind, not the crying of despair or performance, but the quiet, involuntary kind that happens when the thing you have been holding finally finds a way out. He did not move to comfort her, which was the right response, because comfort would have been condescension, and he understood that. He stood there with his hat in his hands and let her have the moment, and when she had collected herself and wiped her face with the back of her already dusty glove, he was still there, exactly where he had been. "I have watched you too," she said, because it was true and she was done pretending it was not. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been accumulating, all the fence-line conversations and the practical rhythms of working alongside each other and the Lockhart drive and the months of his quiet, respectful presence. She let it be full. She was not afraid of it. "I don't think I'm easy to know," he said finally, which was an honest assessment rather than a warning. "I'm not exactly uncomplicated myself," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not the dramatic opening of a previously closed man, nothing cinematic or sudden, but a small and genuine relaxation, the loosening of something that had been held for years. "No," he said, and the single word had warmth in it that she felt in her sternum. They stood at the fence line while the September light changed around them, not talking about love, which was not a word either of them was ready for yet, but existing in the new configuration of what had been acknowledged, which was more substantial than words anyway. October brought the legal resolution with Creed. Birch's exploitation of the procedural error had resulted in a judge in Lockhart issuing a formal ruling that the injunction against Creed's interference with the Boone claim was valid and binding, which meant that any future fence-cutting or cattle interference would constitute contempt of court. Creed had responded to this by going very quiet, which Birch said was his pattern when a target became too expensive, and which he expected would be followed by Creed finding a softer target somewhere else in the county. Letitia had gone to Lockhart to receive the news from Birch in person, and Warren had come with her again, and this time the 40 miles had been different because the thing between them was acknowledged now. It occupied the space between them on the wagon seat with a kind of comfortable weight, and they had talked differently, with the particular openness of people who have decided to stop treating their own inner lives as secrets from each other. He told her about Abilene. Not because she asked, she would never have asked, but because he had apparently made the same decision she had made, which was that the dark past did not need to stay dark forever if you chose to bring it into the light. He told her about the woman whose name was Clara and the partner whose name was Beck, and the 2 years of quiet betrayal that he had not seen because he had trusted completely, and trust, he had learned, could become a kind of blindness if you let it replace instead of accompany your own judgment. "I was 28, he said, with the flat inflection of someone who has made peace with a story but not with its full weight. "I thought I knew what I was building. I didn't know I was building it on someone else's plan." She thought about Aldous Prentice and the debt that had followed her father from Tennessee to Texas. She thought about hidden motives and the way damage done by someone else's choices becomes yours to carry. "The trap is always the thing you weren't watching," she said. He had looked at her sideways on the wagon seat and said, "Exactly that." And something in the precision of the agreement made both of them quiet for a mile, the comfortable, thoughtful quiet of two people who have found another point of deep recognition. The day Birch delivered the ruling, they had celebrated in the way of practical people in 1884 West Texas, which was to have dinner at the hotel restaurant in Lockhart, which was not a fancy establishment but had good beef and a proprietress who minded her own business. They sat across a table with a cloth on it and 2 oil lamps between them, and he ordered for both of them after asking her what she preferred, and she told him what she preferred without deferring to his guess. And the small exchange of mutual consideration felt significant in a way she thought about for a long time afterward. After dinner, walking back to the wagon in the cooler October night, he had stopped on the wooden sidewalk outside the hotel and said her name. Just her name, the full name, Letitia, in the low, deliberate voice. And she had stopped and looked at him, and he had reached out and taken her hand carefully in both of his. His hands were rough from years of fence, wire, and leather, and the West Texas elements, and they were enormously warm, and she felt the warmth travel up her arm and settle somewhere central. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, if that's something you'd consider." She was 24 years old, and she had never been properly courted, and she was standing on a wooden sidewalk in Lockhart, Texas in October of 1884 with her hand in both of his, and the night sky above them enormous with stars. And the thing she had been pressing down since March was pressing back so hard she thought it might displace something vital. "I'd consider it," she said, and he smiled, a real smile, the one that moved all the way to the gray-green eyes, and she thought she had never seen anything more purely satisfying in her life than Warren Sawyer when he fully, genuinely smiled. Courtship in Caldwell County in 1884 looked like what it was, which was two people who were already deeply respectful of each other discovering that they were also deeply pulled toward each other in the specific way that has nothing to do with practicality or convenience. It looked like Sunday afternoon visits, either at her front porch or at his, with coffee and serious conversation, and the occasional long silence that neither of them found difficult. It looked like working alongside each other whenever it was natural, the rhythm of their labor still fitting as well as it had in July when they had repaired the north fence, better now perhaps because the acknowledgement had removed the tension of the unspoken. It looked like the November morning when she was wrestling a piece of broken harness leather back into workable shape on the front porch, and he arrived on horseback, and instead of helping, which he could have done, or offering advice, which he also could have done, he simply sat on the porch step and watched her work with that particular expression on his weathered face, the one that had no performance in it, only honest, admiring attention. And she had looked up and caught the expression, and something had flared between them, hot and clear and entirely mutual. She had set down the harness leather and said, "Come up here." And he had come up, and he had kissed her for the first time on the front porch with the November wind coming cold across the flat country and the smell of cedar on it. And it was not a tentative kiss, or a preliminary one, but the kiss of two people who have been patient for a long time and have decided that patience has been satisfied. When they broke apart, she was looking at his face at very close range, and what she saw there was the real version of him, the version underneath the habitual firmness. And it was, she thought with a clarity that surprised her, the face of someone she could build something with. The face of someone who had been broken by hidden motives and forced choices, and had put himself back together into something that could be trusted because he had decided that the betrayal he had survived was not going to become the thing that defined him. "I am entirely in love with you," he said, and it was so direct, so entirely without embellishment or qualification, that she felt the simplicity of it like a clean strike, something that cuts through everything else. "I am in love with you too," she said, because she was, and she was done with the pretense that she wasn't. He laughed, which was a sound she had not heard enough and intended to hear considerably more. It was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep, surprised by itself, genuine the way few adult expressions of joy manage to be genuine, and she stored the sound of it in the same place she stored important things, the way you store something you know you will want to have access to for the rest of your life. December brought the resolution of the Prentice debt, which arrived not because she had managed to pay it in full, she was not quite there yet, but because Birch had connected her with a different financial instrument, a small frontier bank in Austin that dealt in proving claims, and which offered her a loan at a reasonable interest rate to clear the Tennessee debt entirely, replacing Prentice's extraction with something she could manage on her own terms. The loan officer in Austin had looked at her documentation, her land records and cattle inventory, and the legal victory over Creed, and had extended the credit without the condescension she had half expected. She had written to Aldous Prentice one final time, enclosing a bank draft for the full amount of the debt with accrued interest, calculated to the penny, and had signed the letter in her best handwriting and had felt, sealing the envelope, the specific satisfaction of a person who closes a door they have needed to close for a long time. "Done," Warren had asked when she told him, and the single word had contained so much. "Done," she said. He had come to Christmas dinner at her house, which she had made into a real occasion with the first roasted chicken from her own flock and a dried apple pie, and a tablecloth that had been her mother's, carried from Tennessee, in the one trunk of personal things Clement had allowed for sentiment. It had been the first Christmas dinner she had made for another person since before her mother died, and she had felt the ghost of all the people she had loved and lost sitting at the corners of the table, and had honored them silently, and had then turned her full attention to the living man across from her, who was eating her food and talking about plans for spring with the focused, happy expression of someone who is exactly where they want to be. After dinner they had sat by the fireplace, which was the small stone fireplace her father had built in the first week they had arrived, and Warren had reached into his coat pocket and produced a small object that he held out to her on his palm without preamble or extended ceremony. It was a ring, a simple one, a gold band with a small oval turquoise set in it that caught the firelight. It had been his grandmother's, he explained, the one who had come west from Ohio in 1849, and it had come to him through his mother and had been in his possession for years, kept in the particular way a man keeps something precious and uncertain, not sure of its eventual destination. "I am certain of its destination now," he said. Letitia picked the ring up from his palm and looked at it for a long moment. The turquoise was the blue-green of desert sky, of water over stone, of certain October mornings when the weather was still warm and the grass had gone golden, and the whole enormous Texas sky had turned a color she did not have a word for. The ring was simple and genuine, and it had history in it, and she was 24 years old with calloused hands, an approving claim almost won, and a man in her firelight who had seen her clearly for 9 months and had not looked away. "Yes," she said, and put the ring on her own finger, which was the practical gesture of a practical woman making a permanent decision, and he covered her hand with his and held it, and the firelight moved over both of them, and outside the December wind came cold across the flat country, and inside the small stone house on the Boone claim it was warm. They married in February of 1885, which made a kind of symmetry because February was the month that Clement had died, and February was now going to be also the month his daughter had chosen to begin the next part of her life, and she thought he would have found this satisfying. The ceremony was in Prairie Wells, in the small church that the congregation had built 3 years ago, and that served the scattered families across several counties. Marjorie Connell cried enthusiastically, as was her nature. Birch the lawyer and his wife came from Lockhart. 3 of Warren's hired hands were there in their best shirts. Warren had worn a dark coat she had not seen before and had his hair combed back and his face shaved clean, and she had looked at him standing at the front of that small church and thought that he was the most honest thing in the room, honest in the specific meaning of being exactly what he appeared to be. No hidden motive, no trap, no dark past that was still dark. Only a weathered man who had earned every line on his face, and who was standing there waiting for her with an expression she had come to know as the one he only wore when he was completely, unguardedly happy. She wore her mother's tablecloth, which had, it turned out, been large enough to be made into a simple dress by Marjorie Connell, who had a talent for needlework, and had insisted on this contribution with a warmth that Letitia had accepted without argument. The dress was ivory cotton with a small eyelet border, and it fit her well, and it carried the smell of cedar from the trunk, which was the smell of Tennessee and her mother and everything she carried forward. The preacher said the words. She and Warren said theirs. He put a second ring on her finger, a plain gold band that matched his own, next to the turquoise ring. She felt the weight of both of them, the history of his grandmother and the promise of this morning, and held his hands and met his eyes and meant every word she said. The joining of the two properties was practical, and also something more than practical. Warren's 400 acres adjacent to her 300 made a farm of genuine substance, and the cattle from both herds, consolidated and managed together under a single operation, made an enterprise that was solid in a way that neither alone had been. They discussed it with the same directness they brought to everything, without illusion and without sentimentality, talking about water rights and grazing rotation and the fence line that had previously separated their land and now needed to be relocated or removed entirely. "We should take it down," Warren said, meaning the fence. "Between our properties, no reason for it." "I'll help," she said, and he looked at her with those eyes and said, "I know you will," and the warmth in it could have heated a room. Spring of 1885 was the proving year's end. In April, Letitia went to the Lockhart courthouse with her 3-year cultivation record, her cattle inventory, her maintenance logs, her water improvements documentation, and Warren at her side. Not because she needed him there. She had earned this herself and he was entirely clear on that. But because he wanted to be there and she wanted him there. And those two wants were allowed to coexist without complicating the independence of what she had accomplished. The clerk reviewed the documentation with the painstaking thoroughness of county clerks everywhere, then stamped the papers with the particular authority of a bureaucratic instrument, and the Boone claim became the Boone-Sawyer deed, because she had kept her name in the property record, and he had not suggested otherwise. She stood outside the Lockhart courthouse afterward in the April sunshine with the deed paper in her hand, and felt the specific, hard-won completeness of a thing finished well. 3 years from the advertisement in the farming newspaper, 2 years from arriving with Clement on this land that neither of them had seen before, 1 year of being alone with it. Now this. "We should go to dinner," Warren said. "Same place?" she asked. "Same place," he said, and they walked to the hotel restaurant, and the proprietress, who minded her own business, gave them the same table, and they ordered beef and sat in the lamplight, and Letitia set the deed on the table between them, and they both looked at it for a moment. "Your father would be proud," Warren said. She had thought about this often enough to have rehearsed what she would feel, and yet the actual feeling, hearing it from Warren's voice in Warren's presence, was bigger than the rehearsal. "Yes," she said steadily, "he would." The summer of 1885 was the best growing season the land had had since the Boones arrived. The grass came in thick and the water held, and the cattle, now 32 of them running on the combined property, gained weight through August in a way that Warren watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been doing this for a decade and knows what right looks like. Letitia had expanded the kitchen garden and added a small orchard, 6 apple trees and 4 pear, which would not produce seriously for a few years, but which she planted with the long view of someone who intends to be somewhere for a very long time. She had also, in a gesture that was both practical and sentimental, moved her father's almanac collection from the shelf in the original farmhouse to the shelf in the larger house that was now hers and Warren's shared home, which had been Warren's original house, better built and more weatherproof than her smaller frame structure, which they had repurposed into storage and a bunkhouse for the hired hands. Clement's almanac sat between Warren's agricultural journals and the small collection of novels she had been accumulating from the dry goods store's irregular book shipments, and the sight of them together on the shelf gave her a particular feeling she did not try to examine too closely. In September of 1885, she told Warren she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 3 weeks and had confirmed it as much as she could confirm anything in the absence of a doctor. And she told him the way she told him everything important, directly and without extended preamble, on the front porch in the late afternoon. He had been very still for a moment, the way he went still when something moved him deeply and he was working through it. And then he had crossed the porch and taken her in his arms, carefully, with the specific tenderness he reserved for the things he valued most, and had pressed his face into her hair and said nothing for a long time because he didn't need to. "Are you all right?" he said finally. "I am enormously all right," she said. The doctor in Lockhart confirmed it in October and told her what she needed to know and gave her the cautionary information he was obligated to give, and none of the patronizing commentary she had half expected. She was healthy and young, and her body had been well fed and well worked, which was, he said, the best preparation for this. Warren had been attentive in the autumn, and winter in the particular fashion of a man who has discovered he possesses a capacity for care he had not fully known existed in himself. Not hovering, because Letitia would have found hovering intolerable, and he understood her well enough to know this, but present. Making sure the water was heated before she knew she needed it. Taking the heaviest fence work himself without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing so. Sitting beside her in the evenings with her feet in his lap, reading his journals while she read her novels, which was a form of domestic peace she had not expected to find so early or so fully. She still worked. This was not a point of argument between them because Warren had never suggested it should be otherwise, but it was something she felt she needed to say explicitly one evening, that she intended to continue working her share of the property and the household through the pregnancy, that this was important to her. "I know," he said, without looking up from his journal. "You don't have a problem with that," she said, making it a statement to confirm it. He did look up then, and the expression on his face was somewhere between amused and serious, the combination that she found most specific to Warren, the one that meant he was engaged with something that mattered. "Letitia," he said, "I fell in love with you at the fence line. I'm not going to suggest you leave it." She laughed. The real laugh, the one that startled her from the inside. He smiled and went back to his journal, and the fire burned down and the November wind moved outside and the house was warm. Their son was born in May of 1886, on a Tuesday morning when the light was coming through the east window. Marjorie Connell had come to help, insisting with the generous forcefulness she brought to all her contributions, and the doctor had come from Lockhart the day before when it became clear the time was near. The labor was long enough to be frightening, and then it was over, and Warren was in the room because she had told him she wanted him there, and he had been, standing near the wall, being quietly, utterly present in the way she had known he would be. They named the baby Clement, after her father, which had been her first impulse, and Warren had said immediately, before she could work up to asking, that it was the right name. Clement Warren Sawyer, which was what was written on the county birth record that Warren filed himself in Lockhart, riding there and back in a single long day, because he wanted to have the record filed while the Tuesday morning was still in it. When he came back from Lockhart, she was sitting in the rocking chair her father had made, nursing the baby in the evening light, and Warren came through the door with the trail dust still on him and stopped when he saw them, and the expression on his face was the one she would remember when she was old and thinking about the best things she had witnessed. He crossed the room and crouched beside the chair and looked at his son with the complete, frank attention he gave to the things that mattered, and then he looked up at her, and neither of them said anything, and everything was said. Little Clement grew with the land, which grew well. The summer of 1886 was profitable enough that Warren paid off the last of a supply debt he had been carrying with a merchant in San Antonio, which cleared the books entirely for the first time since he had started the operation. He told Letitia this at the kitchen table in August with the same flat certainty he used for practical assessments, and she recognized what it meant to him, because she knew what clearing a debt felt like, and she put her hand over his and they sat with it. The operation expanded carefully, in the way of people who have both survived the consequences of expansion attempted too fast. 2 additional hired hands in the spring of 1887, the fence line redrawn and consolidated. A water catchment system installed along the creek bed that Letitia had designed based on something she had read in an agricultural journal, and that Warren had built out with the meticulous thoroughness he brought to structures that needed to last. Harlan Creed had moved on, as Birch had predicted, finding softer targets in other parts of the county, and eventually, in the early part of 1887, had found a target that was not as soft as he expected. A family named Rays who had filed a complaint formal enough and documented enough that the county attorney in Lockhart had opened an actual investigation. Creed's legal difficulties occupied him fully through the rest of that year, and the news when it came from Birch was that Creed had sold most of his operation and relocated to somewhere in New Mexico, taking his method of working beside the law with him to whatever territory would tolerate it. Letitia had felt, hearing this, not triumph exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a justice that had been patient. She wrote to the Rays family, whom she did not know but whose situation she understood in specific detail, offering the introduction to Birch that Warren had once offered her, and received a reply a month later expressing gratitude in terms so genuine that she had to put the letter down and look out the window for a moment before she finished reading it. In 1887, 2 years after the deed was secured, 5 years after she and Clement had arrived on this land, Letitia looked at the Boone-Sawyer property from the top of the slight rise to the north, the rise that Warren had shown her the first spring after they married, because from it you could see the full extent of what they had built, and she counted what she saw. The house, solid and well-made, with the addition Warren had put on the previous winter that gave them a proper sitting room and an extra bedroom for when the family, as he put it with the composed expectation of a man who was clearly planning on one, got larger. The barn, repaired and expanded, smelling of horse and hay and the good smell of animals well kept. The cattle pastures, green from the water management, 38 head now moving in the slow, purposeful way of cattle that have enough to eat. The kitchen garden in full midsummer production, the orchard trees, still young but alive, bearing their first tentative fruit. The fence line she had repaired the first week of March 1884, less than a month after she had buried her father in the ground behind the house she was standing in front of now. Warren came up the rise behind her because he had seen from the yard where she had gone and stood beside her, and they both looked at what they had made together in this difficult, demanding, extraordinary country. "My father would have wanted to see this," she said. "He saw you start it," Warren said. "That's not nothing." She leaned into his side and he put his arm around her, natural and easy, the way they had learned to occupy the same space without effort. The baby was in the house with Marjorie Connell, who came regularly now, and had become something between a neighbor and family in the way that frontier community sometimes created. The bonds formed by proximity and shared difficulty deepened into something genuine. "I think we should plant another section," she said, "south of the creek. I've been looking at the drainage and I think it can support winter wheat." "Show me what you're thinking," he said, and turned with her toward the land, and they walked down the rise together toward the fence line, toward the work, which was also toward the life, which was also toward everything they were. That autumn she told him she was pregnant again. This time he was in the barn when she found him, mending a piece of tack, and she stood in the barn doorway with the September light behind her and said, "We're going to need that second bedroom sooner than I thought." He set down the tack. He looked at her face. Then he crossed the barn in 4 steps and kissed her, the thorough, certain kind of kiss that she had known since November of 1884 on the front porch, and she held onto his coat lapels and kissed him back, and the horses moved quietly in their stalls, and outside the September wind came warm and golden across the mesquite flat. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1888, when Clement was nearly 2 and already conducting the early experiments in locomotion and communication that were making both his parents reconsider how much peace and quiet they had previously taken for granted. They named her Margaret, for Warren's mother, and she arrived into the world with a voice that immediately established she had opinions, which Letitia found entirely appropriate. With 2 children and a growing operation, and a partnership that had deepened into something she was sometimes unable to fully comprehend with her whole mind, only able to feel with the whole of herself, Letitia Boone Sawyer looked at the life she inhabited and thought about the woman who had turned away from Warren at the fence line in September 1884 because she was afraid to be seen, and felt a kind of love and grief for that woman. For the loneliness she had been carrying so effectively and so privately, for the months of darkness and labor and uncertainty. That woman had been right to be careful. She had also, eventually, been right to turn around. There were still hard years. 1889 was a drought year that tested everything and required the kind of disciplined reserve management that made both of them quiet and focused in ways that an outside observer might have mistaken for strain between them, though it was not strain, but rather the shared silence of 2 people working a problem together with complete mutual trust. They made it through 1889 with the herd reduced but not devastated, and the water catchment system proving its worth in the specific way that well-built things prove their worth when conditions are bad. They replanted what needed replanting and bought 3 new cattle and opened a bank account in Lockhart that was for the particular purpose of reserve, so that the next drought or the next crisis would find them with a layer between it and catastrophe. Clement started at the Prairie Wells School in 1891, which required him to ride a pony the 4 miles to town 3 days a week, and Letitia had stood at the gate, the first morning watching him go with the particular complex feeling of a mother who has been both fierce about her child's independence and unprepared for its specific emotional quality when it arrived. Warren had stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders and had not said anything, which was the correct response. The school had been built partly through a community subscription that the Sawyers had contributed to, and the teacher was a young woman from San Antonio who was also, in Letitia's private assessment, one of the most purely competent people she had met since the lawyer Birch, which gave her confidence in the institution. Margaret followed Clement to the school 2 years later, and the house in those few hours of quiet felt enormous and strange and oddly peaceful, and Letitia and Warren used some of those hours for the kind of conversation that you cannot fully have when children are present. The long, unhurried, circling kind that covers everything from cattle prices to the nature of time, to the question of what their parents would have made of this life they were living. "My father," Warren said one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee, the house quiet and the autumn light coming through the window, was a man who believed that the land was the thing. That if you had land and worked it honestly, everything else would eventually resolve. Was he right? She asked. Warren considered this with the seriousness he gave to genuine questions. Mostly, he said, the land has to be the right land, and you have to be willing to work it on its own terms, not yours, and you need someone to work it with who understands that. She looked at him across the table in the autumn light, this man who had watched her from his horse for 6 months before he spoke to her at the fence line, this man who had handed her fence posts and legal introductions and his grandmother's ring and the specific, irreplaceable gift of being seen clearly and not found wanting, this weathered, honest, complicated, good man. "You found the right land," she said. "I found more than that," he said, in the low, deliberate voice, and held her eyes across the table, and she felt the warmth of it settle all the way down into the part of her that had spent so many months protecting itself from warmth, and was glad, profoundly and permanently glad, that she had eventually turned around. The decade turned and life continued on the terms that good land and good work and good partnership can create, which are terms that have their difficulties and their sorrows, because No honest story has none, but which have underneath them a bedrock of genuine substance that weathers those difficulties without cracking. Clement grew into a serious, observant boy who had his mother's efficiency and his father's patience, and an intense interest in the cultivation of things that expressed itself first in a small personal garden he had planted at 7 and expanded every year, until by 13 he was producing enough vegetables to supply both the house and a small surplus that he sold to the feed store in Prairie Wells with a focused commercial satisfaction that made both his parents look at each other over his head with expressions of recognized familiarity. Margaret grew into a girl who was, in ways that were both amusing and occasionally challenging, very much like the woman Letitia had been at 16, which was to say entirely clear about what she thought and not at all interested in softening it for social comfort. She also, unexpectedly, developed a passion for horses that she shared with Warren, who had never had anyone to share it with, and the sight of the two of them in the corral together, patient and focused, working with the young quarter horse they had bought in the spring of 1893, was one of the things Letitia stored in the collection of images she kept like a private almanac of the best things. In 1894, when Letitia was 34 and Warren was 46, a third child arrived, a fact that had surprised them both in the manner of genuinely good surprises, the kind that arrive when you have stopped expecting them and discover they are welcome anyway. This one was another boy, and they named him Thomas, for Letitia's maternal grandfather, a man she had known only from photographs and stories, but whose name had the weight of Tennessee mountain country in it and seemed to her to carry a particular strength. Thomas was a different child from the other two, rounder and sunnier and less intense, inclined to laugh at everything including his own tumbles, and he had from his earliest months the specific quality of being easy to love, which is a gift some people carry from birth and carry forward, changing the temperature of every room they enter. The property in 1894 was not the same property it had been when Letitia had repaired that first fence in March of 1884. It was larger, in acreage and in the sense of what had been built on it, and better, in every technical measure of land quality and cattle quality and water management, and it was home in the specific, unrepeatable sense that a place becomes home when enough life has been lived in it. She walked the fence line sometimes in the mornings, the early mornings before the household was fully awake, when the light was just beginning and the dew was still in the grass, and the enormous Texas sky was doing what it did at that hour, which was to shift through colors that had no names yet in any language. She walked the fence line and thought about the woman who had arrived here with her father and her grief and her absolute refusal to fail, and she felt that woman inside her still, unchanged in her essential nature, only surrounded now by more than she had planned for, more than she had allowed herself to imagine in those first months of brutal solitude and labor, more than she had thought the world would agree to give her after it had taken so much. Warren found her at the fence one morning in September, which made the anniversary of his words to her, a decade now, and he came on foot because the morning was cool enough and the distance not so great that a horse was needed, and he stood beside her at the north fence line, the one they had repaired together in July of 1884, the one that no longer marked the boundary between their separate properties, but ran through the middle of something they had built jointly and completely. She did not turn away this time. There was nothing to protect herself from here with this man, and there had not been for a very long time. 10 years, she said. Thereabouts, he said. You stood right about here, she said. You had your hat in your hands. I believe I always have my hat in my hands around you, he said, which was both true and a certain kind of love declaration, the kind that is so integrated into the daily texture of a life that it carries more weight than a ceremony. She took his hand, rough and warm, as it had always been, and held it in both of hers the way he had held hers on that Lockhart sidewalk in October of 1884, and they stood at the fence line in the September morning with the grass gold around them, and the sky enormous above them, and the cattle moving slowly in the near pasture, and the house behind them with 3 children in it who were beginning to stir, and would shortly make their presence loudly known. "I have watched you work," she said, echoing him, giving it back after 10 years, "and I have never seen harder." He turned to look at her. The gray-green eyes with the deep lines of years of squinting against this specific sky, the jaw with the familiar firmness that had become over 10 years the most reliably comforting thing she knew how to look at. "You have," he said quietly, meaning both that she had watched him and that he had been worth watching. Both things true, both things acknowledged. She leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the fence line in the Texas September morning. And the light came, and the land held, and the life they had made together between them was whole and full and real and theirs, and everything that had been uncertain was resolved, and everything that had been broken was mended, and everything that had been lost had been, in time, returned in forms they had not expected but could now not imagine being without. The fence line where it had started. The fence line where they stood. The fence line that was not a boundary anymore but a part of the land they walked together, morning after morning, year after year, in the enormous and demanding and extraordinary country they had chosen, and which had, eventually, chosen them back. Thomas's laughter came to them from the house. Then Margaret's voice, explaining something to Clement in the decisive manner she had inherited from her mother. Then the sound of the door and footsteps on the porch, and Clement's voice calling across the yard in the voice of a boy about to be a man, steady and curious, his father's patience in it, his mother's efficiency. Warren squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. They turned from the fence line toward the house, toward the morning, toward all of it together.